Nichtern, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be back with you.
Likewise. So why confidence? And do you prefer confidence or self-confidence?
This is my fourth book in the mindfulness and Buddhist kind of realm, and I always try to write something slightly different and something that I've, really been working with. And I think specifically with confidence, because it's been something I've always worked with and struggled with. And, whenever I talk to the many people I talk to about meditation, mindfulness, Buddhist psychology, when we delve one step below kind of the basics, this idea of how to show up to life with confidence and struggling with confidence is almost always some version of where the conversation goes. So I wanted to really look into both what the Buddhist teachings might say about confidence, what my own experience is, what, some modern movements in Western psychology may have to add. In terms of self-confidence versus confidence, I do think that the confidence that this book is about trusting ourselves. But, in the introduction, I talk about, this seeming irony or perhaps even contradiction or dissonance that, from a Buddhist standpoint, one of the, central philosophical and psychological insights of Buddhism is there is no solid self. So that question of if there's no self, how can there be self-confidence is, it's an intriguing question, but I also think, we don't have to get too philosophical about it. We're talking about having confidence in our own experience and our own ability to show up to whatever our mind and whatever the world throws at us. So, I think they're one and the same, but we could definitely talk about what are we having confidence in if there's no solid self.
Just to say, there were a bunch of things in your opening salvo there that I do want to follow up on. But since we're on this self part, my take on that, I'd be curious to see if you think this is correct. So in Buddhism, there's a kind of often misunderstood assertion that there is no self, but there's no solid or separate self. So you can't find some core nugget of Ethan. And to the extent that Ethan exists, which he does, it's in relationship to the rest of the world, the rest of the universe. It's inextricably interwoven. That's one part of it. And even if you don't get what I'm saying, the other part of it I think is easier to get, which is that there are kind of two things that are true at the same time. One is that on the level of consensual reality, of course we all exist. I'm talking to you, you're talking to me. We've got a bunch of people listening who are producers, people who are listening who right now who are producers, and people who are out listening this asynchronously who are consumers of the show. We all exist. On a deeper level, you can't find some little globule behind Ethan's eyes, between his ears, that is the distilled Ethan that doesn't exist. And it's kind of like the difference between me sitting on this chair and having confidence that it's a chair while knowing that at the ultimate level, it's spinning subatomic particles. And so to me, you can get wrapped around the axle in this debate about the self, but it's actually on some level could be a distraction in this conversation.
There's different ways that this is talked about. I like Mark Epstein talks about the difference between the functional self, which is, those of us who are having this, you and I having this conversation, living our lives, trying to figure out our experience. If there's no self, then whose podcast is this, right? And what he says that Buddhism calls into question is the representational self, right? So another way that's put that I note in the introduction is that when you actually get into what Buddhist philosophy says, is it only questions certain aspects of the self, like its permanence, its independence, right? Its particular sense of singularity and it's me at the center of the universe, and sort of this feeling, and I think this really relates to confidence, is the need to be seen as subjectively more important, than other selves, right? But at the same time, we're on this path and we're, interested in these ideas and these practices because we do exist and we're trying to figure out how to be in the world, and we're not going to transcend that experience. And all kinds of experiences come up that really make us have to figure out how to show up and how to work with things as they are, and instill a lot of fears in us. And we have to say, how do I work with those? How do I show up? So, I mean, it's kind of moot, right? The question of like, the question of is there a self in Buddhism is really about looking at the ways we act on the false belief that we are solid. But the idea that we're here and we care about our lives and we exist relative to each other, and we're born and we live and we die, that's just observational. That's just what's going on. So I think we could get a little too sophisticated. It's useful to get sophisticated, and Buddhist philosophy does a really great job of getting sophisticated. But at the end of the day, it's sort of like, yeah, so now I have to put on my pants and try to be a grown-ass person. How do I do that?
Let me go back to some of the things you said earlier. You said that you struggled with confidence for a while. What's that about?
It's an ongoing struggle, but, that idea of trying to figure out how to be and show up to myself, show up in relationships, show up if we're trying to achieve anything. I mean, in some ways, wouldn't you say that your formative experience on the meditation and Dharma path was a moment that you got? I mean, you had one of the most famous panic attacks in Dharmic history now it is, right? So isn't that sort of a working with confidence and working with that struggle? But I've had those experiences too. I show up to teach and go, why the hell does anybody think I know more than them? Why are all these people listening to me? You have longings to succeed, and you say, like, is this going to succeed? Are they going to answer my text? Am I going to get this book published? Am I going to be a good friend or a good father? These are all the kind of questions of the struggle. So I think anybody who says they don't struggle with confidence is lying a little bit.
I was saying last night, I was having dinner with some friends, and I was talking about, I like to brag about the fact that my wife is working on a book, and the book's about imposter syndrome. And we've been running this experiment. Well, I've been running the experiment, which is that every time we're in a social setting, I tell everybody she's writing this book because I want to see what people's reactions are. And uniformly, women are like panting and just like, I need this book. This is such a huge issue. And men stare at us with bovine indifference. This is a gross generalization, but there is some rough gender breakdown. And this is obviously using the outmoded, gender binary here, but like they're among the men that I know, there are some who are totally open and willing to talk about their lack of confidence, but there are many who've just never thought about this before, or we're programmed or socialized, us men, to just brazenly display confidence all the time, that it's not a thing where we feel comfortable looking at.
It's something I've heard some rough generalizations about, patriarchy and so forth does create different roles. And I know a lot of the women I know sometimes feel like to even show up to something, they have to show up perfectly, right? And men are just like, I'm gonna just throw some stuff at the wall and see what sticks. But I also think if men really don't know, are really claiming to not know what imposter syndrome is, they're kind of lying.
They may not have heard the term, but usually once Bianca explains it to them, they understand. But I'm surprised by how many men are like, yeah, that's just not a problem I have. And there may be a certain amount of denial rather than lying, or maybe there's some lying too. I don't know. One of the jokes, and this is a common joke that I hear, but like one of the women at the table last night was making the joke about how she wished she could muster the same confidence as all the mediocre white men she knew.
Oh, yeah.
Which is hilarious.
And we got two of them right here.
Well, everybody at the table last night who was male said the same thing.
Yeah, no, Lord grant me the confidence of you see that meme on social media a lot. Lord grant me the confidence of a mediocre white man. Yeah. I mean, I think that's another way of looking at this. I mean, part of the inspiration for writing this book was, we live in the age of influencers. We live in the age where our country saw the first reality TV president of all time. And, I think there is a lot of truth. I mean, as a man, I like talking about my struggles with confidence, because I think we also live in an era of a lot of false confidence, like a lot of performative confidence. Like, I got this, rather than, okay, I'm going to work with my heart, I'm going to work with my mind, and I'm going to show up to the struggle.
One of the things I see on social media is there's certainly a lot of bluster. You're right. False confidence, curation, the building up of brands and personas that seem to be in a state of bulletproof bliss. There are, however, if you look at social media, there's a lot of people advertising their mental health diagnoses as well. So there's like kind of a whole subgenre. It's maybe even now like the main genre of people talking about not how confident they are, but how messed up they are.
I think it's an interesting balance, right? And I think this is kind of, where if you look at the framework of the Four Noble Truths that our teachings have, that the first step is always to acknowledge a problem, right? Acknowledge some kind of dissatisfaction, some kind of confusion, some kind of struggle. So here, if we're talking about confidence, that first step might be to acknowledge just insecurity, right? And I think there is a kind of, you're right, the diagnostic quality, there is more of that sort of in the mental health / spiritual realm. There is more of this kind of diagnosis of, oh, I have the problem, I have the problem. And on the other extreme, there's a lot of people saying, I'm fine, I'm good, or I have found the trademarked quick fix solution to the problem. And I think, this is the great thing about Buddhism is it doesn't promise easy solutions and it doesn't ignore the problem. So I think we have to work with that if we're going to talk about insecurity or difficulty with confidence, is we have to say, okay, we can actually settle into the confusion or the suffering or the dissatisfaction here. And we can say, I would like to be able to, as I call it in the book, hold my seat more completely when life strikes, when I feel like an imposter or feel however I feel. And that will lead to some evolution so that I'm not stuck with the problem, right?
Right.
So it's not necessarily having a solution. It's about having a path, and that's what I say in the beginning and end of the book. Confidence for me, it's not an endpoint. It's a practice, So when you say, are you a confident person? You could, the Buddhist standpoint would be like, well, I practice confidence rather than I have it or I don't have it.
I'm just writing that down. I like that a lot. It's not about having a solution. It's about having a path. It's like I have not solved confidence, or I've not solved my relationship to the constant change in the universe. I have not solved anything, but I do have a practice that allows me to handle it better some percentage of the time.
I listened to your podcast, and I notice one thing I notice about you, Dan, and I think we have we know each other a tiny bit. You have become one of the biggest voices in mindfulness and Buddhism in the North American world. But you often, I noticed you did this because my dad was just on your podcast. You often say, now I'm no expert in any of this, right? You disavow you take extra steps to disavow your expertise. Are you afraid of getting sued? I don't know.
Now, honestly, that is it. I might do it sometimes as an unhelpful, falsely modest tick. So I'm open to that. I just as a brief digression, for a long time I had this tick. Yeah, I think you'll probably hear it in some of my early episodes where I would just kind of lazily just refer to myself as an asshole a lot, which is funny once or twice, but then I got the feedback over time that like I was overdoing it, and I've really tried to pay attention to that. I mean, sometimes I'll make jokes about being an asshole, but like, man, this shtick was getting a little tired. And so it's possible that that's happening too on the, I'm no expert. But what I really mean by that word I'm trying to signal is that I'm not a Buddhist scholar. And so I have some understanding of the Dharma after having written a few books and, 700 episodes or however many we've done on the show. I know a little bit, but I'm not a true Buddhist scholar or somebody like, the Venerable Analayo who's been on the show, or Bhikkhu Bodhi or somebody like that. The guys who come on this show, people who've come on this show and really know what they're talking about. And then the other thing is, not only am I not a Buddhist scholar, I'm not a meditation teacher. I have not done the amount of training that you, Ethan, have done on the cushion to really present myself as a meditation teacher. So what I'm really trying to do is caveat emptor here, like that. And I want to protect myself and the listener from, if I make a mistake.
There is an aspect of putting oneself out there that includes a little bit of humility and a little bit of context.
That's a good word, humility, because the line between humility and confidence is an interesting one to look at, because you can be falsely humble, and I've done that, and I've made that mistake, and will probably continue to on bad days. But you do want to be genuinely humble, and actually, in some weird way, I can kind of connect that to being confident.
In their true expression, they're flip sides of the same coin in a way, right? Because humble is the aspect of I don't know what I don't know. And the more you know what you know and can kind of settle into that and trust yourself, that's the way I think of confidence, is really, when you look it up in the dictionary, it's about trust, right? So firm trust is one of the main dictionary definitions. So the more you can say, I know what I know, then you can say, I don't know what I don't know. And, I also know about being a Dharma teacher and on the scholarly side of things, that the more study we do of the mind and these teachings and other, adjacent or related teachings, the more you realize that there's different answers to the same question, right? And that's one thing I've noticed, that really great teachers who know a lot usually say something like, well, if you look at it from this angle, it's like this. But if you look at it from that angle, because they've actually collected a lot of wisdom and information, and they've seen it play out in different human contexts.
You used a phrase a few minutes ago that is key in your book, holding your seat. That's kind of a Buddhist term of art. What do you mean by it?
There's a few threads coming together in the introduction of this book, but there's a metaphor for assuming one's meditative posture, right? That is called taking your seat, right? So in the way that I learned mindfulness meditation, the instructions of posture and the step at the practice where you enter the practice and really arrange your posture is called taking your seat. And we could look at it just very functionally, that there's points of posture: sitting comfortably, grounded, long spine, etc. In some of the classic texts, it gets very precise in terms of the different ways that the body is arranged. But there's also an energetic quality of taking one's seat, like arriving and saying, this is my spot. This is my spot on earth. And there's kind of an inherent act of confidence in that, of it's not about disappearing, right? This is not, I sometimes joke that Buddhist meditation should be called non-transcendental meditation, because not to at all diss TM. I know a lot of people who've gained a lot of benefit from TM, but the idea is that we are arriving in the body, arriving on the earth, and there's a real sense of kind of claiming one's spot, and to the two mediocre white guys comment, right? There's also this sense. Our first Black Congresswoman, Shirley Chisholm, has this famous saying, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair, right? Which has this sense of arrive, show up on earth. You're here, you can practice, you can be here, you belong here. And then as the experiences of a meditation session hit us, which are, related to kind of in the book and in some of the Buddhist teachings, like forces like wind, knocking us off our seat, our ability to actually stay with those forces, which, could just be an itchy nose, could be, a really scattered mind, what we might call monkey mind, could be difficult emotions. our ability to actually be present with those is called holding your seat in the Tibetan teachings that I received. So taking your seat is arriving and claiming your spot and arranging your posture, and then working with difficult experiences, anything that knocks us off a little bit. When we can stay with that, it's called holding your seat.
You referenced the wind. The book is built around a Buddhist list. The Buddhists, as many listeners know, love to make lists. But the Buddha himself loved to make lists, and that tradition is carried on for 2,600 years. And I believe this is a list from the Buddha himself, the 8 worldly winds. I actually really love this list, and I love that metaphor of the wind. Can you tell us what this list is and why you've chosen to build your book around it?
I love finding metaphors, for writing and trying to convey these principles or these teachings. And this list has always been, a lot of teachers talk about it, but I never feel like it's given sort of the time it's sort of due. So I was just with our friend Sharon Salzberg on the Tricycle podcast, and she always refers to this as the vicissitudes, but you often hear teachers refer to it more poetically as the 8 worldly winds. And these are basically 4 pairs. That's how this list of 8 is built. 4 pairs of experiences that happen to every human, right? And they are the experiences of being in the world. And in each of these pairs, one of the experiences refers to what we hope is going to happen, right? The more pleasant, the more comfortable, the more sought after experience. So that the wind that knocks us off our seat, but in a good way, you could say. Falling in love has that sense of like, it feels really good, but you might, forget to pay your rent when you fell in love, right? So it knocks us off a little bit, but in a good way. And then on the negative side is the feared part of the couple or the pair, right? So there's these 4 couples, and I wanted to dedicate like a lot of time to each of them because they really are sort of the experiences that when a person is trying to show up in the world and do something in the world, succeed in some way, have worldly success in some way, are going to hit us. Hope and fear, right? Desire, and I don't want that. And so this also relates, using the wind analogy, to a body of teachings from the Tibetan Tantric tradition, which are called the teachings on wind horse, which is how to ride the wind, which I talk about towards the end of the book, which is a pithy set of meditations for rousing one's confidence, right? And I got the image in my head, and kind of the central image of the early part of the book. I love these characters. If you've ever driven past a car dealership or a mechanic or, a car wash, those tube people that are blowing in the wind. They're really tall, wormy looking, and either they have an air blower running through them or they just go with the wind. And there's really this great metaphor for how life, when we get what we want, it inflates us. The tube person, when animated by wind, they just kind of yay, cheer. And then the animating wind leaves and they just get so deflated. And it's the deflated tube person is such a good visual metaphor for how it feels when we fail, when we don't get what we were trying to get, when nobody knows our name or nobody cares that we're here. So that sort of notion of working with this inner tube person and how to really make peace with having an inner tube person as these 8 different experiences strike us while we're trying to hold our seat in the world. That's really where the metaphor of the whole book came about.
Well, I'm just going to list the pairs so people know them, and then we'll go through them together. Pleasure and pain, praise and blame, influence and insignificance, sometimes called fame and disrepute, and success and failure. So those are the winds. I like not only the wind person that you're referring to, but also that the wind is impersonal. And it's such a force of nature. And in some ways, you can think of these ups and downs, these vicissitudes as you don't have to add on the self. You don't have to make it so personal. And in some ways, it makes it easier to deal with. It's part of holding your seat.
It is impersonal, but it's also has this quality of anytime we take our seat in the world as a person, it's guaranteed that we're going to feel these forces, right? There's no way around them.
So in your view, confidence is not like cockiness and it's not comparative. It's not relative. I'm better than this person. It's something deeper. It's a resiliency in the face of whatever happens that you can keep your shit together.
Exactly. Yeah. Resiliency is a great word. This is related. So again, the notion of wind horse in the tantric Buddhist teachings has a lot to do with this. Looking to the earlier Buddhist teachings, there's this term that's usually taught in relationship to the 8 vicissitudes or the 8 worldly winds is this term upekkha or upeksha in Sanskrit, which usually gets translated kind of, this is the one that I find people are a little bit confused by. It's translated as equanimity, right? And equanimity, I think, is a little misleading for me just because there's a sense of not being affected by the winds, and I like the idea of what happens when we are affected. How do we work with being affected by hope and fear, pleasure and pain? If somebody really says, if those dudes you were at dinner with really say, oh yeah, criticism just rolls off my back, that's the point I'd say, like, I think you're lying, I think you're lying or fooling, or there's some ignorance there's some avoidance going on. And so to really say, well, maybe that equanimity means this resiliency, or maybe it means I can show up on a windy day and I can still work with it, So it's not necessarily it's going to go perfectly, right? It's just like I can do the hard thing and show up to being a person.
Let's go through the list. The first pair, as mentioned, is pleasure and pain.
There's so much to say about pleasure and pain. And I think, it's interesting how this list builds on itself, because pleasure and pain, in a sense, are the most visceral, the most tied to our nervous system and our sense perceptions and our embodiment. I think of all these winds, you could say, these are the most consistent signals that we receive from our experience. And when we're doing a formal meditation, it's a really good chance to specifically work with, doesn't necessarily have to be pleasant and pain in the sense of like, pleasure, but it could be comfort and uncomfortable feelings in meditation. And just noticing how often we are actually struck by those and how often we lose our seat. I know one way of looking at pleasure and pain is the way our body responds to just stimuli for discomfort. And, I think about this a lot in terms of, having a young daughter and myself sometimes struggling with this, like smartphone usage, that need to kind of soothe the itch that we all experience and how much we get kind of thrown off of our seat, scrolling, etc. And, I think there's been a lot of really good research in recent years about how, brain chemicals work, dopamine, cortisol, serotonin, etc. But I think, in a sense, mindfulness of body is really designed to help us try to work with becoming less responsive to pleasure and pain. And it's really interesting and in some ways, I think, counterintuitive what meditation practice does to our experience of pleasure and pain. It doesn't actually make us experience pain less.
No, I mean, sometimes one of the cliches is that hurts more, but you suffer less. That you can actually feel the pain, but you're not adding on voluntary suffering.
I mentioned the pain experiment that Dr. Richard Davidson did. I don't know if you're familiar with that experiment, but it really illustrates this. And he had, novice meditators and more experienced meditators, and Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche was sort of the like Jedi level meditator in the experiment. But What happened in that experiment, I mean, I explained it in greater detail, was basically they found that becoming a master meditator basically increased the activity in the pain receptors during a painful experience, which is completely counterintuitive. It decreased the rumination and bracing phases of having a painful experience, right? Which is maybe a little bit more expected. But during an actual painful experience, Mingyur Rinpoche's pain receptors spiked higher than somebody who had never meditated, right? So this is not the way to sell mindfulness. Like, I can't imagine the Calm app, being like, feel pain more, But that is sort of the key to suffering less, is like when pain is happening, feel it completely, right? And so I think that's really an interesting way of looking, which also means, by the way, that when pleasure is happening, you would feel that more completely too, right? So that's the good part. That's the very good news in that you would actually be paying attention, and I think that's another thing with our smartphone usage, when we're scrolling, like we could see something that's sometimes when you're on social media and you're scrolling, there is some of the most creative stuff. There's people making the most brilliant statements about the world. There's like your old high school friend with this amazing moment, something really meaningful happening in their life or their family's life. And then you just scroll past it, right? So we don't experience pain enough. We don't experience pleasure enough. Because they're just knocking us around and kind of just being like, okay, give me another soothe, take away my pain, right? And when we can hold our seat, so to speak, there's a wider range of appreciation that develops. And, that is definitely something that I don't know if you would say that you're more able to appreciate pleasure and pain because of your meditation practice. I would certainly say I am.
Absolutely, my meditation. But, this is not false modesty. I just want to acknowledge that my meditation practice is a lot younger than yours. But yes, I definitely noticed that, particularly on the pleasure side. Interestingly, because I'm definitely on the greedy end of the spectrum. I like pleasure, and so like tasting my food, things like, or getting a hug from my wife or son. Like those moments feel better. That I used to kind of scroll past them, metaphorically speaking. On the pain front, just to say, and you said this, but I just want to reemphasize it, that the good news on the pain front is, yes, in the moment of displeasure, your brain is likely to recognize it more acutely, but you'll have less bracing for it and you recover more quickly on the other side. I believe that's what Richie's work has shown. And so,
yes,
all in all, it's a much shorter experience. So I can notice this, for example, when I'm getting shots. I don't like to get a shot, but I'm much less freaked out beforehand. Then when it's happening, I do really feel it, and then it's over. And so I'm not adding a lot of unnecessary suffering, extending the experience in either direction.
I worked with that recently, MRI, I don't know if you've been in a head first MRI, but a year ago I was. It was a really intense claustrophobia experience, and the way I worked with it was to settle in, find my relative points of safety. They have a little mirror that you can sort of see your feet through and see that there's space there. So that helped kind of work with the initial spatial panic, and then just really tuning into the noises that were happening. It's like a set of musical elves who are trained by John Cage are just making all these like sounds in there, and to really tune into that and say, let me be present. Again, this is not false modesty, but the nice technician, when I got out, because it was a long MRI, he was like, you stayed really still, Meanwhile, I literally almost had a panic attack at the beginning of it, but I was able to settle in by using this, like, okay, let's really be present with the uncomfortable experience. And it really shifted the experience. I have a root canal tomorrow, so we'll see how that goes.
Ooh. Yeah, I struggle with that.
The 10% Happier podcast is available early and ad-free over on our companion app, which is also called 10% Happier. No ads. And like I said, you get it early, about a week before everybody else does. Relatable wisdom, no distractions. Download the 10% Happier app wherever you get your apps. Let's keep working down this list because actually a lot of points I want to get to. Praise and blame.
The words we use for each of these couples really might unlock, meaning for us. So criticism, right, is another way of looking at this. And I think this one is so important because in terms of what we're hoping for and what we're fearing, right, pleasure and pain are really tied into our physical body and our nervous system. Praise and criticism are really where our sense of identity starts to be social or interpersonal and reputational, right? So human beings are social creatures, right? We survive in our group identity. I mean, if we really didn't have to care what anybody thought of us, this probably would not be a wind that struck us. But if somebody thinks we're great, it has a pleasant effect because it might mean like we're going to get something, If somebody is criticizing us, it might mean that our standing in the relationship is called into question. So it's interesting because from here on out, the couples leave sort of the directness of our physical experience and go into our sense of self. And here they start going into our sense of relational self, right? So we're always giving and receiving feedback to the world. And I think this one is really fascinating because, if you look at, say, feedback you get on your work, I always think it's fascinating to get like an email from somebody who's read something I wrote, and the brain is lethal on this front. Like somebody can have bullet pointed like 9 positive things about the thing they read, and there can just be one criticism in there. And before I even know what's happening, it feels like my brain goes straight to the criticism, right? I don't know if yours does that too. So we're really afraid, and I think this is because it has to do with our relational self, of being critiqued in some way or being blamed for something. And we are really seeking like somebody, tell me I'm doing a good job. Give me some validation, And so we this is another pair of fear and hope, or hope and fear. And it gets into our reputational self and how easily that's knocked around. I mean, this one is really fascinating because somebody says something nice, oh, I like your shirt. And the inner tube person just raves. And then somebody says just one little thing that we can interpret as a criticism, and we lose it completely, just deflated for the rest of the day.
So what are your practices for dealing with this?
There's a bunch of practices that I talk about, and some of them come from teachings, Buddhist and other teachings on listening deeply and right speech. But I think the most important thing here is, again, to prepare for the wind in each of these. In other words, if we exist in relationship, it means we are going to receive criticism at some point, So, and to realize that each of these couplets kind of follow the same premise of pleasure and pain. So as long as we have a nervous system, we're going to experience pleasure and pain. As long as we exist in relationships, we are going to experience criticism and praise, right? So the first I would say is the same way we have to know that things hurt. Whenever we're in a situation where we're going to receive feedback, I say we should prepare for the ouch, Something in there is going to hurt, And if it doesn't, well, then we're just setting ourselves up to get hurt next time, because then we did one round perfectly, and that cannot happen again. There's never been a human who never received criticism. So I think for me, it's like, rather than saying, okay, how am I going to defend myself? It's just prepare for the ouch. And then I think really making friends with that inner tube person is important with all of these wins. I think another important thing about receiving feedback is to know who we're asking and why. My friend Susan Piver, who's a writer and Dharma teacher and entrepreneur, she gave this really good piece of advice once. So she had a friend who, whenever she was working on an entrepreneurial project, she would ask what he thought, but she would often ask when the project was in its very nascent stages. And he would basically point out all the potential problems. And she realized that it was too early to ask him because his feedback was really helpful if she could withstand it. But the project hadn't gotten going enough in her head, and she just needed more creative inspiration and time for positivity. Later on, she learned, let me ask my critical friend, so that his feedback could kind of fine tune and sculpt the finishing touches rather than undercut all the energy for the project. So I think knowing who we're asking for feedback, if it's something that we're trying to do, and trusting the sources of feedback. And I think another way to work with receiving criticism is to practice some form of loving kindness, if that's a practice that we have for ourselves in receiving the criticism. And also to realize that maybe there is information in there that is useful. But on the other side of the coin, I think because we know about the negativity bias, which I think is so important, where that we need to receive more validation than criticism to even receive the criticism. I think having people who validate us is really important. I think about this as a parent, like, yeah, sure, it's important to tell my daughter that she didn't tie her shoes properly because I don't want her to trip. But it's more important to say, it's so great that you're trying, right? I think about this as a Dharma teacher, like you really have to praise people's efforts, and I think whenever we're putting ourselves out there, it's really important to have a sense of, okay, at least I did my practice, at least I showed up to this effort. So, and then the flip side of this is, and this is because it's a relational wind, praise and blame, or a relational pair, is we are not just in a position where we are receiving these experiences from the world. We can also give them to other people, right? We can give people praise and criticism, right? So actually understanding that power of how and when we speak, and one thing I am grateful for. I mean, I like to every once in a while just share my opinions when it's the right time to do so. But if somebody wants feedback on them, luckily for me, I'm a little exhausted about giving people feedback. So I don't feel the need, as I once did, to tell people what I think of them unless they ask me, And I think that's actually really an important aspect, is to know when it's time. I mean, we can always give people feedback when it impacts us, if they're doing some behavior or there's something that is actually our business. But to know when you're being asked for feedback and to know that you're actually putting a force into the person's being. If you praise them, it's going to have an impact. If you criticize them, it's going to have an impact. My great uncle Irv, who was considered kind of a mensch of the Jewish half of my family, has great advice on right speech in this case when we're giving people praise and blame or criticism. He said, don't ever tell anyone anything unless they have a place to put it. And I think about that a lot. I think that's really good Dharma advice from a secular Jewish man who's no longer with us.
Right. So, I mean, the right speech is another Buddhist term. Often it's described. The Buddha said to his son when in teaching him how to do right speech, say that which is true, that which is useful, and say it at the right time. And that kind of rhymes with what your great uncle Irv said.
And say it kindly, right? So say it, and I think that part is important because kindly doesn't mean you have to tell somebody what isn't true, but say it in a way that you are at least acknowledging their effort and acknowledging their humanity, I find that in social media, I find these days it's almost useless to try to have dialogue about anything really on social media. I mean, social media is great for sharing what we're doing or what we think with the world, but when it gets into dialogue, you really have to try to establish trust. And the only way to even have a shot to do that is to say, I understand you, I care about you, I disagree with you, and social media has turned into this like dunking space,
We've gone through 4 of the 8 worldly winds: pleasure and pain, praise and blame. The next is influence. The next pair is influence and insignificance, which I've sometimes seen listed as fame and disrepute. But we're in an era where influence or clout or fame is more sought after based on the survey data I've seen than at any previous time. So this is a rich one. You want to say a few words about it?
I agree that we're in that era. So classically, as you said, this pairing, I think in most translations I've seen, is fame and either infamy or disrepute, right? But I think also the era that we're in, you can do pretty well with disrepute. If you get hated by one group of people and liked by another group of people, you can leverage it. Sort of anti-heroes have a kind of fame, and really the fear is insignificance, that nobody knows us, nobody remembers us, nobody finds our effort or our work worthy. And yeah, I was really playing off of, I don't think people, will say like fame, I want to live forever, I want to learn how to fly. It's more like I think the word that is often used with people trying to put themselves out there these days, it's almost like our word for fame now is platform, right? To have some kind of influence, to be an influencer, not necessarily in the like social media. I said in the book that I believe the first person to claim the term influencer was Paris Hilton. I believe that's, in my research, that's where that term came from in 21st century use. But you want to be able to have recognition or some ability to shape and be known for doing something amongst a larger group of people, right? You want an elevated platform. And the fear here is that we will be unknown. We will be viewed as insignificant. Nobody will notice our work. Nobody will notice our contribution. So I think there's a real fear of aloneness in this, right? I use the example, kind of a more simple example for those of us who don't have any public facing platform and don't want one. It could just be how we want to have influence or renown within our family or in our work community, right? But the example I use is coming back from a meditation retreat. I don't know if, and just, you come back from a week or 2 weeks or, a month at a meditation retreat. And, there is this feeling of having had so many deep and rich experiences, and time has moved in a different way for you. And you really want everybody to have felt your absence, right? And so you get home and that all your friends and colleagues are going to want to be like, what was it like? Are you enlightened now? And a lot of times the experience is just like, on your block. It just feels kind of empty. Maybe you missed some news, maybe some really crazy things happen in the world, but probably just the world kept turning as it was. And then you are waiting for people to be like, what was it like? And the conversation when you come home turns into like, oh, wait, you were out of town? I don't know if you've ever had that experience.
A million times. I come home from a retreat and it's like, this has been this huge experience for me. And I've been thinking a ton about all the stuff that's happening in my absence. And I come home and people are like, yeah, hey, welcome back. Oh, where were you? Or like, they don't even want to talk about it, which I get. I totally get. I now at this point don't expect anybody to give a shit, but totally. I totally understand that experience. So what is, you reference a few things, few ways to deal with this pair of wins, significance and insignificance. And one of them is and you use this word already, but to contemplate aloneness. What does that mean?
To realize what I reference here, and this is coming from actually a Disney movie named Coco, which gave me the idea that really when we're talking about death in relationship to this experience, there's 2 deaths. that happen for a human being. One is physical death, and the other is reputational death, which means when nobody knows that we were here anymore, when nobody remembers us. And so aloneness, I would say, is a willingness to be okay when we are not interacting with other people and when other people are not thinking about us. And, you know, I think when we die and when we're unknown, which by the way happens to everybody, you know, I mean, your other option is to be one of the very few people throughout human history who is known thousands of years after their death, but undoubtedly you're misremembered, right? I mean, Buddha, Jesus Christ, undoubtedly, if they looked at the ways they're remembered now, they'd be like, my life wasn't like that, you know? It's not who I was. So, you know, we have to work with this real tender experience of we will be forgotten, you know? And I think a lot of the ways we seek recognition, right, and seek to make an impact is not necessarily about our work or our being of benefit to the people around us, but it's actually about not being forgotten. And when we're forgotten, you know, which is what we all experience in the silence of a retreat, we are fundamentally alone with our own mind. It's just that tender moment where you're just here, and I don't know that I'm ever going to be able to explain my experience to anyone else, and maybe I won't have the opportunity, right? And so I think if we can contemplate aloneness and really say, what does it feel like when I'm with myself, which is one big thing that meditation is all about, but I think a retreat actually brings this home even more. What does it feel like? And if I do have influence, right? If I do have a platform, what do I want that influence to stand for when I'm no longer here? And not just when I'm no longer here, but when nobody remembers me, right? So even thinking beyond the influence we want to have when we're gone and our name is on a building, you know, when that building crumbles, what impact do we want to have? And I think that's really the full meaning of aloneness, is actually to be willing to tolerate, what if nobody knows me? And can I still make a positive difference, right? If the wisdom side of wanting to be known or seen is wanting to have a positive impact, then is there a way to think about that impact free from, I can't stand the idea of not being known by other people?
I'm just trying to put a fine point on this suggestion here. I think you're saying, as a thought exercise, we should contemplate, given the fact that the odds are incredibly high that there will be a time in a few decades, maybe it's 100 years, maybe it's a little bit more, that even if our name is carved into the side of a building, nobody remembers who we are. There's nobody alive who has any memory of us. And the history books say little, if anything, about us. And so given that fact, what kind of influence do we want to have?
Yeah. And also, while we're here, how do we want to use whatever influence we might have as if we were already free from needing to be recognized? Because I think we can use recognition very well, you know. I think I'm talking to a person who's used their recognition very well, used their platform well. That's not a false compliment, by the way. That's just genuine praise to your inner tube person. We can use that well, but when we cling to the hope that everybody's going to know that we used it well, right? I always wonder how Taylor Swift feels. You know, the 80,000 screaming fans are going to scream for me. When that's the reason we're doing whatever we're doing, there's a corruption, right? Because we're chasing a hope. We're chasing this pleasant experience that cannot last, right? And it's going to evaporate. And then we're either going to have to do something to rebrand our platform or remake it to get that attention back on us, you know. And we do live in an era of intense attention seeking, I would say, and it's nice to actually want to use whatever influence we have and there to be examples where we're trying to use it because we actually want to live a good life while we're here, and we want to be a benefit when nobody remembers us.
I'm trying to think about that from myself, just not to make this about me, but just to understand the concept better and use myself as an example. So you said a nice thing, great for my inner tube person, about using my influence well, but I for sure have what the Buddhists might call some degree of bodhicitta, a sense of wanting to be of benefit. But I also have an ego, and that's there. And I mean, I'm aware of it. Probably not aware of the full extent of it, because if I was, then I wouldn't be so yanked around by it. But I am aware that it's there, at least to the best of my ability. And yeah, I don't know that I'm doing everything. I know I'm not doing everything out of uncut benevolence.
Well, I think we have to not make the perfect the enemy of the good, right? That is why imposter syndrome arises in some way. And I think that's right. If I can't do this completely egolessly, then why do it at all, right? And that's why I think of this as a practice, right? Like, and it's sort of not being fooled by the chase, right? If I'm chasing the recognition, or I'm chasing praise, if I'm chasing pleasure, then I'm going to get stuck. I'm going to get fixated on something that's disappearing. If I can move towards that with these contemplations of how can I actually live a good life and help, then we can actually use the ego in service of bodhicitta. And it's almost like the ego starts to burn itself up as, solar energy. It's like, oh, I can use that. And as I'm using it, I can work with, okay, what do I actually want? I talk about this in the book, wanting to be a writer, which is something I wanted to be since like 6th grade. The particular reason I wanted to be a writer was because I figured I was an extrovert and an introvert, because writing was a way that people could know and love your work, but not really know your face, and that seemed perfect to me, like the ego of wanting people to know my work, but also through that wanting to express something that's actually meaningful and beneficial, right? So it's not one and it's not the other. But if we're completely caught in hope and the mirage of hope, like I'm going to be the most famous Buddhist ever, which is a thought people might have, I don't know, maybe the Buddha had that thought, that might have been why he started meditating. We don't know, actually, right? If we have that and it's not met with sort of like, okay, but what happens when you're alone with yourself? It just kind of goes out of control, and I think we can bring some real modesty to saying, okay, we do have these egos. We do want a platform or to achieve something. And at the same time, I can notice the false chase, right? And I can temper my ego with some compassion and some reality.
Let's get to the final two wins, success and failure.
So this is the most generalized. Sometimes you see this one translated as gain and loss, but because I really wanted it to speak to sort of how we work with achievement, as mindful people, I went with the translation of success and failure. And so this is the most generalized because success is just any endeavor that we have, any identity that we strive for, any project, right? We hope it succeeds and we fear that it fails, right? And that's just being human. And we all have a fear of failure. We all have a hope of success. Whatever we're trying to do or be, in spiritual life, we often have very highfalutin hopes of like, I'm going to achieve enlightenment, which you tempered, no, we're just going to 10% happier. That's my achievement. I don't know if that's gone up at all for you. If you maybe it's gone down to 9%. I don't know. And we fear, this is going to fail, and I think this also the big thing to work with in this arena is how we compare successes to the perception of other people's successes. I tell the funny story of actually succeeding in getting a book published and feeling actually quite a lot of success until I found out that an old friend of mine from college who was a writer I really admire. So I got my book published. I was feeling tons of success. And later that day, somebody I went to college with won a MacArthur Genius Grant for their fiction writing. And this is somebody whose work I love and is a good person. His name is Ben Lerner. And just that feeling of like deflation, like I had gotten my book published earlier in the day by the same publisher, right, as Ben Lerner. And I felt for like 3 hours, I made it, mama, I made it. And then somebody I respect and admire got an even bigger worldly success, and the two-person deflated. And it didn't last very long, and I wouldn't talk about it if it was like an ongoing thing. But it's so weird how we need to compare successes, and I think there's a few arenas in life where that makes sense. I think we set aside sports as an arena where a healthy competitive structure exists, right? But it's totally a construct, And when you look at things like writing a book or being a decent meditator, or being a good partner, right? I mean, why would we ever compare like a relationship or a marriage to the health of other marriages? We're only married to that one person. We only need it to be good in that structure, right? We only need one person to think we're doing a good job as a partner. And so we look at all these ways that when we enter this frame of success and failure, we're constantly looking over our shoulder and comparing to how we perceive other people are doing. And I think our world is really set up, to exacerbate competition where there doesn't need to be any. And so we work with a set of practices, as you know, in Buddhism that are sometimes called sympathetic joy or mudita. And it's specifically a way of working with envy or jealousy, which, I think we've done a lot of work in spiritual and psychological spaces to talk about some difficult emotions. We talk a lot about anger. We talk a lot about anxiety. For whatever reason, envy and jealousy, it's just like people don't like to really talk about it. That's why I wanted to tell that particular story about envying someone who had great success, because, I think we need to talk about it more. And the practice of mudita is actually flipping the frame. And when somebody has a success that we perceive ourselves wanting, ourselves feeling less than or not enough in relationship to actually flip the frame and say, I hope this brings them joy. May they enjoy this success. And the other part of, I think, working with comparative mind is whenever we perceive somebody else as succeeding, to really tune into what is it that I long for, right? In this case, it was my friend is a really talented fiction and poetry writer. I love writing fiction and poetry. I don't get to do it enough. I wish I got to do it more. So actually, all that was there when I tuned in very quickly to wishing this person joy was, I want to write more poetry. I want to make time for that. I don't make enough time for that, And that's all it was, So I think there's something about comparative mind is that it tells us what we long for, but then it ties that longing into another person's perceived happiness rather than working with our own longing.
Yeah, but you say in the book, and I like this a lot, can you turn the person you're jealous of into
instead of being a source of exasperation, into a source of inspiration.
And it's easier when we don't feel hurt and resentful, of the person, when it's just like, oh shit, I wish that happened to me, which is a lot of what little moments of envy and jealousy feel like. I think sports is a good metaphor, because when you look at rivalries in sports, there usually is a sense of gaining inspiration from one's rival, right? They're actually pushing you to be better. So it's actually in some ways a very healthy, relationship. Like if you look at like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, right? They had a very close relationship, and they actually, I don't know if at Kobe Bryant's memorial, Michael Jordan was just sobbing, crying, because they had pushed each other in a really healthy way, right? And inspired each other. And I think, when we're outside of sports, we can actually appreciate other people's successes and say, what are they doing well? And how can I allow that to inspire me?
Time out for 1 second. So we have just a few minutes left, and we've gotten through the 4 worldly winds, but we have not gotten through the 4 powers of confidence. In the remaining time, like what dealer's choice, like what would you like to focus on?
I mean, I think kind of the healthiest way to wrap this up, like quickly, would probably be to talk about wind horse specifically, because it returns to the wind metaphor. But
so we've worked our way through the 8 worldly winds, and in the course of that discussion, you've talked about some antidotes or some practices that we can use to ride the wind more in a more effective way. In the book, you talk about some other tools. You call them the 4 powers of confidence. They are compassion, lineage, kind of thinking about your forebears, awareness, mindfulness, which is just coursing through this entire discussion, and wind horse, which you did reference at the top of this discussion, which is this Tibetan notion of being able to repeat a phrase here, ride the wind in an effective way. Can you, as we wrap up here, say some more about this?
So wind horse is a set of meditation techniques that were specific to Tibetan or Vajrayana tantric Buddhism, and were taught in the Shambhala tradition, and have a lot of tie-ins with indigenous Tibetan cultural wisdom as well. And basically, these are considered pithy when they're done as a meditation. They're considered pithy instructions, meditations that a person can do in 2 minutes, 3 minutes, often are done, and I offer one version of that in the book. And they're often done as preparation, when we have to show up and do something hard in the world. So one could do them, at the end of a longer morning meditation session, when you're going into your day and you're feeling deflated, or you could do them before a difficult meeting. I often will do wind horse meditation before I'm teaching, as a way to work with, the little bit of, lingering nerves. I've been teaching now 22, 23 years, but still, every time you have to show up with other people, that those winds are hitting you internally. And so wind horse is based on the principle of, and I like that it ties into this metaphor of the 8 worldly winds, of taking the emotional energy of whatever is arising, acknowledging that, focusing oneself quickly, and then softening towards whatever is happening, and then rousing one's awareness to meet the moment as it is. There's a lot more to the principles of wind horse, but it's a meditation that I wanted to share. There's different forms of it, because I do think it's so helpful and effective to those times where we need a brief meditation that allows us to really acknowledge what we're experiencing right now, and rouse ourselves and open our heart and open our awareness to meet the moment. There's a lot more to be said about wind horse, but I think that's enough for now.
Don't leave us hanging, though. Give us the pith instruction.
All right. You want to do it together?
Sure.
All right. We'll do the 3-step version. So just want to, invite everybody who's listening to take your seat. So since we've been doing a lot of talking and listening, you may notice that the energy is more towards your ears and your head and your brain. So just see if we can bring that down to the earth for a moment. That which is connecting us to this actual spot in our life. Now, quickly and as fully as you can, bring your attention to your heart center. Almost like a tea light candle lighting up in the heart. There's a sense of strong focus for a few moments. Not furrowing your brow, but just really bringing everything to the heart. And then soften that focus, stay in the heart, and just feel your heart. If there's any strong emotions, just notice that. There is nothing, just notice that. Soften and feel the heart for a moment. And then the final step, staying in the heart center, but now we are going to expand awareness in all directions. So if you are used to meditating with your eyes closed or downward gaze, just for this brief period, I'd invite you to look straight ahead so that there's a sense of really being in the space that you're in. And without pushing, just from the heart center, see if your awareness and presence can go out in all directions, opening to what's in front of you, the side body, space behind you. It's called opening out or radiating out. Just see if we can stay in open space for 10 or 15 seconds. Okay. You can do that in 2 minutes. So bring your attention fully to the heart center. Soften. Feel what's in your heart right now. And then the last step, this sense of expansion, raised gaze, opening out to space, radiating out.
And the idea is this is a way to build your inner resources to deal with whatever noxious winds might be headed your way.
The inner resource, yes. I mean, I think having good supports on one side, having friends who are there to support and love and help us is useful. Having a strong self-compassion practice is useful. Working with resting in awareness is very useful. And I think having a strong sense of what Buddhist teachings talk about, and I spend a whole chapter on this in that second half of the book, one's lineage, one's ancestors, all of the beings we can call on when we're having a difficult experience or need a little extra help, who have our back, you know. And then I think something like this practice where we actually say, all right, this is hard. I have to gather myself and open out, right? So that's another way of looking at that. Very simple. In the book, there's a 5-step version of the wind horse meditation. Gather at the heart, feel, open out.
I feel like a wind horse. I feel like Rainbow Bright, actually. But
all right, yeah. I mean, I'm more of a Care Bear, but
yeah, nice. I picture you as a rainbow barfing unicorn. But
wow, why am I barfing, Dan?
That's what they do on the memes. They barf.
Oh, okay.
You know. Ethan, thank you.
Dan, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for having this podcast.